Wednesday. Welcome to Data Day with our good friend Dean Crook from Data Analytics. Boy, we got a lot to talk about this
Yeah.
morning. Yeah, Dean and I were just discussing about some rulings. Oh man, it's going to have a huge impact on a lot of things. So we're going to get into that.
Yep.
Again, thanks for joining us. And here
Hey, Lisa.
we go.
To the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
You're back. Yeah.
Boy, was that some news this morning, huh, Dean?
Yeah, on top of AB5 and all the ripple effects it's creating on the West Coast, that ruling by was it a federal court? It was a federal court ruling, right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Good morning, Lisa. Good morning, Antoine. How are you? Yeah. This morning, early, I read a article in Freight Waves about the ruling against Snyder National regarding the independent contractor agreement, and it is shattering, to
Yeah.
say the least.
Yeah.
Shattering. What
Yeah, right.
are your thoughts, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, John Kingston's one of the better journalists in the country, and he's been an energy oil expert for years and years. Some of you may remember him from being on TV many years ago, but he's been covering AB5 exceptionally well. So when he writes about it, it's well thought out commentary. But this ruling is very interesting because for essentially an independent contractor that has their own authority to be treated like a leased on owner operator or a company truck in a forced dispatch scenario is really interesting. I mean, I don't know why you do that. And you could see why the driver who had his own authority was upset because of the limitations placed on him. Of course, that's all in the article for everybody to read. But it really defines this AB5 ruling in another context, right? And that is that if you're going to be independent, you've got to be treated truly independently.
Correct.
Which is not what the article is suggesting, is that even though the guy was an independent contractor running his own authority, he really was treated like a company truck or a leased on owner operator.
Yes.
So that's gonna put a ripple effect through the industry, right? Because you've either got to be truly independent or an employee, and I think that gray area is disappeared.
Yeah, and you can see that spreading out like wildfire. Not just of an AB5, ruling out there in California, but
Yep.
like I was saying, I forgot the name of it, but I know it's Representative Sweeney here in New Jersey, and he had a similar type thing like AB5, and
Right.
I don't know how that's going to go, but with this kind of ruling, you can imagine how many others are going to jump on the bandwagon and start going after the companies that they're leasing from as independent contractors. So this is going to get to a boiling state, Dean. You can see it on the wall.
But Jeff, part of me says we've got to clean up our act, right? Because I did some predictive modeling for a few truckload carriers many, many years ago to predict who'd quit. And some of the drivers with the highest voluntary termination rate were leased on owner operators. So you say to yourself, why would a guy that's been, sold on the idea of becoming their own business person with a leased truck, admittedly too much stuff was being escrowed away, so the viability of the business was always questionable. But why would they quit at such a higher rate? And the reason is they weren't taught how to be business people. But essentially, when you're, this was a retention strategy. So when you go from company driver, one of the ways that carriers try to keep you is we'll pay you more per mile in theory if you can lease one of our trucks.
Right.
They were the guys that quit the most, were the least profitable, were the most stressed. It was a really bad business model. Now I'm talking about 10 years ago, so things may have changed, but the whole premise of the AB5 ruling, of course, was to, beyond the fact that the unions wanted to get more members, which is, always on the cards, was
Yeah.
to really stop the practice of having people paid fairly low wages to haul freight without any benefits. So
Right.
I could see the transition from the gig worker economy to leased on carriers that were in that area, because some of the leased on practices aren't all that attractive for operators. But I think more importantly, though, when you look at the sequence of how you become an independent operator, in the
Mhm.
middle of going from a company driver to being fully independent is this leased on business model where you get some experience under the security blanket of the company who's helping you run your business.
Right.
And take that away, that's a really interesting proposition for someone who wants to get into the industry and become completely independent. You've got to go
Sure.
from 0 to 100 miles an hour in a hurry, and that's going to be a challenge for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and you're right, Dean. But the one thing that stood out more than anything else in this article, which I think is going to have a huge effect, is forcing a driver to take an unprofitable lane to
Yeah.
lose money.
Yeah.
I mean, that is like
Yeah.
an oh my God moment right there.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
okay, so how many other carriers that are
Right.
out there that are doing the same thing?
Yeah.
Now you have this ruling.
Right.
Is it going to change their minds? What do you thought about that? Is it
Oh,
going to change their
yeah,
minds or
absolutely. I mean, sometimes you take a loss on a lane to get to somewhere else that's better. So
Mhm.
losing money on a lane is not all that bad if it's strategically done. But
Yes,
in
that's
the
true.
era of December 18 to August 19, when rates were dropping and capacity was loosening, we were in
Mhm.
an oversupplied market. So there was truck availability. It's not like we were, August, September of last year when people were scrambling for every single truck to move loads for
Absolutely.
customers. This was a pretty cool freight market for that to be happening. Yeah, I mean, there's some fleets that have non-forced dispatch. I mean, the Landstar business model is a good one where carriers can work 8
Yes.
months on, 4 months off. I've got friends that do that.
Yep.
That's very different than if it's a forced dispatch where you can't turn down loads. But to do that to an owner-operator, independent owner-operator, is just mind-blowing that you would do that and force them to lose money. And then, I guess worse, Jeff, is to restrict them on the next leg to pick up another option from a load board or something that was more profitable. Because if
Exactly.
the only reason you take that lower load is to pick up something better on the other end, but not if you don't have control over that next load.
Yeah, and what I have gone through and seen is that when a company has a lot of revenue and it's at stake, and you have a corral of carriers, and carriers want to embed themselves in that business for the long term, sometimes carriers will take a not so decent lane to complement the account to
Right.
say, you know what, you're giving me X amount of revenue, I'll take care of this for you. Even though it's a loss leader and their operating ratio is,
Right.
114 or something like that, they're looking at the whole ball, right? They're looking at the whole account. And so, yes, sometimes like that. But if you look at the other thing, like you said, and said, you must take this load, and it's like a one-off load or something, it's not a lot of revenue, and here you are, a leasee, right? You're moving freight, and now you're told to go and move something.
Yeah. Sometimes you do. I mean, I've done favors for dispatchers. Sometimes
sure.
they say we're in a hole, we've got to move this load, so you take one for the team.
Yeah.
But this sounds to be very different, especially if the U.S. Court of Appeals, the Seventh Circuit, came down immediately and offered this ruling. That's a pretty serious ruling. And I think, though, Jeff, this is AB5's playing out in many, many different ways. Of course, one of the things that John Kingston wrote about a few weeks ago was that AB5's got to be tested. So they've got to litigate. They've got to apply the law on the road. They've got to issue violations, and then it's got to be tested in court so that precedent can be established, or what they call case law around how to deal with this. So
Right.
this is another example where there's precedent now. It's a bit like the carriers that were issued violations for. These were out-of-state brokers running non-CARB compliant trucks into California, even though they weren't from California. And that's sort of, there's all sorts of questions still around, even brokering loads or sending loads into California, even though you're not in California, because
Right.
once you cover once you cross that state line, you're subject to California law. This is going to be fascinating in terms of the impact on capacity and the cost of operating a truck in California and the cost for shippers to ship freight, because I know a lot of carriers who just won't go to California because of the CARB compliance rules. And then if you think, okay, so I can't, one of the leading experts, Todd Amon at ATBS, had a piece on his website that says you can unload in California, but you should deadhead out. You should deadhead out. When you're talking about hundreds of miles. So your inbound lane's going to be loaded with the extra deadhead capacity, a deadhead lane. But then think about, and I did an interview with Deborah Lockridge at Heavy Duty Trucking last week, and I said, part of me thinks that you'll just build a bunch of warehouses around the borders, like at Reno on the 80, or Needles on the 40, or Yuma on the 8. So if you have a lot of these transloading warehouses pop up, does that give California compliance, i.e. only the carriers that run out to the border will be compliant with AB5, and then you have all these other fleets running into California? Either way, that adds incredible cost to the movement of goods in and out of the freight, because no matter what you do, anything heading out of California is a pretty long haul.
Yes. And you know what, Dean? Let's go way back before deregulation and stuff like that, right? And where you couldn't go, you had the authority to go into another state and everything. I mean, just imagine what you're saying, and carriers say, oh no, I'm not going into California. I'm going to drop it in Nevada, and then we'll do a transload into another vehicle and let them do the final mile per se, because that's what we're really talking about, right?
Well, you're talking about drop and hook operations, for the larger fleet.
I mean, just imagine what that cost is going to do for the shipper. It's going to be astronomical. The other thing too is that the insurance umbrella. How much does that cost, Dean? Right. So you think that when you're an independent, I mean, I'm not going to mention the carrier, but 10, 15 years ago, this carrier said, you know what, we're no longer going to put you under our insurance umbrella, and you're going to have to get your own insurance, your liability coverage insurance, and all of that. And then it was during the winter months. And I remember I was friends with a lot of drivers out there at the time, and they're like, nasty weather out there. They're like, hey, listen, I'm not taking my truck out there in that weather, because, if I get into an accident, I'm driving my house literally, because the mortgage is $2,700 a month. Right. I'm not going to jeopardize that, because if I get into an accident, so forth and so on. So, if you're under that umbrella, they're like, yeah, sure, because I know it's going to be taken care of and all of that. So there's so many different variables in this problem, in this ruling, that it's going to affect a lot of people, and you can guarantee rates are going to start going up immensely.
Yeah, the other part of it is insurance. I spoke to a couple of guys that were sort of caught up in this AB5 ruling. They were in the dray market. That really were essentially employees, but just paid under that, 1099 category. And they were happy with what they were getting. It was better than where they came from. And they knew they could do better. But one of them said, in California, our insurance company won't write new authorities. We can't, even though people say, "I'll just go out and get your own authority," we can't do that. Like, we'd have to go to another company. There's a couple of large national underwriters that do write new authorities, but they do more web-based, I won't say artificial intelligence, but they use some pretty good models based on the data you put into your website to underwrite. They don't have people underwriting per se. So they're very good at understanding the risk profile of new entrants. But there's a lot of carriers that are very leery of writing a new authority with no experience in the industry. You will pay the guys that want to get their own authority, even if they could, they've got to look at something like $20,000 to $30,000 in extra cost to get their own authority and buy their own insurance policy. So you think about the cost to run my Class 8 Peterbilt with a trailer is about $9,000 a year with experience and a good record. New entrants are in that $25,000 to $30,000 a year range because they've got no history. The underwriter's got nothing to go on. And to them, they look at the truckload market and say, wow, your radius of operation, your distance, your lack of experience. Our actuaries tell us that this is a really high risk category. Not really understanding it's not about the radius of operation, but it's more when the driving occurs, the time of day that drives the accident risk and cost, not just the length of operation. So that's what they face right now today. And of course, they've just been sued, of course, by the Port of Oakland. So Oakland Port Authority. So there's the whole AB5 thing is sort of playing out before our eyes, but today's news is huge in terms of the implication across the rest of the country.
Yep. And so what are your thoughts about, looking at it from a driver point of view? How many do you think are still wanting to be independent, and then will they go to their carrier's umbrella and work for them directly? I mean, what are your thoughts about that? How is it going to affect the industry as a whole?
I think this precedent today will mean that every single truckload carrier, I guess every carrier, will be looking at their relationship with their their contractors, whether they be leased on or totally independent. I think this ruling will mean that there's precedent now. There's legal precedent that a driver, in effect, could lean on to say, hey, we're not getting the right amount of pay here. We're either paid as employees, the equivalent of paid as employees, or we need to be fully independent and be able to choose our own. So I think it really puts into question the leased on business model fairly seriously, in that these guys that become leased on need to be paid commensurate with what it would be for someone else doing the same job. So you can't just say, I'm going to lease on a bunch of carriers and then not pay them benefits.
Right.
They cost a lot less to operate. And I think that's going to be the real test, is what it costs to run a trucking business these days. So I think that's where the test will be. But legal precedent's very important here for everybody not in California today.
So, they had strikes out there in California, right? They had it at the ports, down in Long Beach, Los Angeles and stuff like this. Do you think this is going to trigger any strikes or anything, or any complaints picketing against this?
I don't think so. Not at the moment, Jeff, because capacity is pretty loose. Shippers have got buying power, purchasing power. There's more trucks than loads, especially in the spot market and the smaller fleet size of the industry. So there's more stability coming back to the market. Carriers really don't have the upper hand like they did. So I don't know that there'll be a lot of movement from the leased on guys, or the independent contractor guys. Guys I talk to are just focusing on revenue per day. They're just trying to crank out $1,200, $1,500 a day and stay in business, be smart about it, keep their operating costs down. Not so much worried about parking their trucks and protesting. The AB5 really was always about the short haul dray market in the ports. It just didn't really resonate with me when the protests were going on as being a larger truckload market issue. But as we just discussed, I think it will be now, especially when you think about, how do I get freight in and out of California? How do I, if I'm a large carrier, how do I treat my leased on operators? Because now you've got to go through all of your workflow and look at, how do we treat and document the dispatching of loads?
Yes.
Now you've got to clearly define whether you're a forced or non-forced dispatch, and take accurate notes in your operating system about how drivers are dispatched, because all that's discoverable.
It's a mess. I mean, to your point, just think about the volumes, and you know what the volumes are coming out of Southern California or even Northern California, right?
Right.
What is going to be the impact,
Right.
based on what you just said, all the dispatchers, the thousands of trucks going in there, the hundreds of thousands of loads in there.
Yep.
What's going to happen to them? How are they going to deal with that volume? And here we are going into peak season, perfect storm right now.
Yeah.
Perfect.
The other thing that, and I won't name any companies, but
right.
a lot of companies record conversations between dispatchers, driver managers, and drivers. It's recorded for management purposes.
Sure.
Some companies do freeform text analytics to predict which driver managers are really, really good at their jobs based on the words they use. So, I mean, the text of, the way we speak to drivers is very instructive if you're a fleet manager. It's also discoverable. So I think this is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. because I think, and the challenge again, Jeff, is that the people that are interfacing with drivers are not typically, veteran people. It's an entry-level job in most large fleets. That said, they're still well-tenured people, but it's a tough job where people are looking to get into the company and out of dispatch as fast as they can, because it's incredibly stressful. It's one of the hardest jobs I've ever done in trucking, is running a board of 50 drivers and lights flashing, and you're trying to manage loads, and you'll do 250, 300 calls a day. It's incredibly difficult job with a fairly short lifespan.
Yep. And in regards to what you just said, I know, and again, I'm not going to name any carriers as well,
Right.
but in the time of Qualcomm
Yep.
and text messaging and all
Yep.
of that, it was actually used in lawsuits too. When a dispatcher said, "I don't care what you have to do, deliver this,"
Right.
and the guy gets into a freaking accident.
Yeah. Yep.
And he's, "Oh, my dispatcher told me to do this." I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking like nuclear verdicts here that I know for a fact that I am not going to say anything. But those are the type of things and reasons why they do that and record those things, because you never know what's going to happen out there.
Yeah. Well, there's some, when I first started working in this country in the 24/7 workforce management / driver fatigue space, there was one company that got hit with a multi-million-dollar punitive charge when their paper logs disappeared. And to my surprise, from that day on, after the damages was awarded, the word fatigue was never to be used in the company. It was banned from any written documentation, because under discovery, a plaintiff attorney would go after that word and use it against the companies. Now, that's tragic in that that's not the way to manage risk, because fatigue is only one component of it. But a lot of fleets are focused on managing the cost of insurance, not on managing the risk. They're two very different things. When you talk to some fleets, they'll talk about the cost of insurance and have no idea how to manage the underlying risk level, which is a totally different business. But anyway, lots of things have changed in the last decade, and there's never a dull day in the freight market, as we've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, unbelievable. But again, we've been talking a lot about this topic, but this is a big one, man. This is a big one today. And, to all listeners out there, this could affect the way that you do business. And, my strong advice is to follow up on it and watch what's going on and keep yourself abreast of the situation, because it could get nasty out there and a lot of things could change rather quickly. And we're only maybe 5 or 6 weeks out before we're in the peak season, and things are starting to shift all over the place, and it will have a bearing on it. It will have a bearing on it, direct bearing.
And it's like, on top of inability to get trucks out of factories because of semiconductor chip shortages and the impacts of the pandemic, and now you think about the potential impact of this on capacity. There's lots of sort of headwinds that we're facing in the truckload industry in particular, in terms of getting enough vehicles on roads. And in some senses, it's been a blessing in disguise that we couldn't get trucks out of factories in the last 18 months in particular. Otherwise, we'd have had a much worse situation than we do today, where overall we've got more trucks than loads, but capacity is still fairly tight in the large fleet truckload contract market. As if you've been listening to the earnings calls of the last couple of weeks, that's certainly the case, and that's a valid statement from those large carrier CEOs. They're saying we see strong demand, but we also see fairly tight capacity. That's very different, though, than the spot market, where volumes have decreased and there's still more trucks in the spot market. Capacity is very loose in the spot market. But interestingly, Jeff, a little bit of stability came back to the market in the last couple of weeks. Spot rates have leveled off, flattened out, actually went up in refrigerated, but I think that's more because of the heat waves we've had across the Midwest and Northeast. Obviously more demand for reefers in that extreme heat. But they went up 2 cents a mile. Dry van went up a little bit. Flatbed continues to, just sort of cool off rapidly. It was down 4 cents a mile this week. They're the line haul spot rates. So the diesel was down another 14 cents, under $4.99 a gallon, which is the first time it's been under $5 since Russia invaded Ukraine. EIA have got it forecasted about $4 a gallon by the time we get to January. But as John Kingston writes about, he's one to follow in terms of what's happening in the oil market. He cautioned that we're heading into winter where demand on diesel inventories will be much higher than what it is now, and it'll be really an inventory situation more than anything. So it right now, as we sit, as diesel prices come down, we're expecting spot rates to start increasing, which is what's happened in the last 2 weeks. But of course, we're heading into peak season, which means there'll be more freight and more demand in all sectors. So our forecasts have got rates heading up for the rest of the year. So before we head off into the first quarter of next year, when things really do start to cool off.
Right. So what are your predictions for peak season? And
Yep.
what do you see? We know there's a shift. I mean, we've talked about this over the last several weeks about the shift that we're seeing from LBLA into Houston, into Savannah, into New York. Are we going to continue going down this road and see these upticks in percentages at these other ports? Or do you think that's going to level off and we'll start getting back to normal in the LB basin?
Yeah, I think the latter is how I see it. I think peak season's already here, and that all that volume that was going to shift has shifted, right? Because back to school inventory is already on the shelves, right? Because we're only 2 or 3 weeks away from Labor Day. And that means back to school. I mean, the teachers across the road from where I live are already back in the car park, getting ready for back to school, and it's only just the second week of August. So summer seems to be already here, and that means that a lot of the experts that write about the ocean space have said that peak shipping is already here. That's why you're seeing this congestion level on the East Coast in particular. I counted yesterday about 42 vessels waiting off Savannah, only 11 according to the Marine Exchange this morning off Los Angeles. Only 11. Yeah, it's a long way south of 109 on January the 9th, right? So there's been this big shift. So I think the shift that you're talking about has already happened, and that once we get past the ILWU labor agreement being signed, ratified, and past peak shipping season, we will start to see a more normal trade flow, if that's the right thing. Although from a commercial point of view, the East Coast ports have done a wonderful job in improving their infrastructure to accept more and bigger ships.
Yes.
And that means that incentive to run from Southeast Asia and Northern Asia through the Suez Canal to the East Coast becomes more attractive to those ocean carriers, as opposed to the heading in the opposite direction out of Asia to the West Coast and then through the Panama Canal. So I think that shift has already occurred, Jeff. But I do think, as we talked about last week, what we're going to see for the rest of the year is this extreme congestion problem that both the intermodal market in particular. So I think for shippers, your colleagues in the shipper world are really still got a big issue with warehouses that are full.
Yep.
Turn times on chassis trailers and 53-foot intermodal boxes are obviously suffering because they can't get things unloaded and get those chassis trailers moving. And that's going to have an impact on the turn times of dray carriers at the port. So I think we're going to see more congestion for the next few months in particular. And so if you've got an exposure to the dray market or the short haul market where there's an exposure to imports or exports, it's going to be pretty tough sledding for the rest of this year.
Yeah, a good thing is I got an email this morning, and if anybody's looking to park intermodal containers or truck or trailer parking, reach out to me. I've got an individual who's got 40 acres out there that's available.
Wow.
In Tracy, California. So if it could help you out, hit me up on LinkedIn, and I'll set you up with the guy out there and might help you out. Who knows? To your point, Dean, we're still at full capacity out there. I don't know when those seams are going to break, but man, I'm telling you, they can't build warehouses fast enough to take in this inventory, and they're still struggling. They're still struggling so bad. Yeah. And another good thing too, you're talking about the East Coast containers and volumes and stuff. Now I know the port in New Jersey and New York, for the last 10 plus years, they've been dredging. They've been deep dredging out there to take these big ships in there in order to accommodate, the influx of these containers. They've done a great job in that area. However, from the last quarterly meeting that I was part of, when I say part of, I listen, to what's going on from the director there, and they're having massive congestion problems out there as well. It's systemic. It's happening all over the place. Are they going to resolve it? They don't see it that way. To be upfront with everybody, they have the same problems with capacity and warehousing as they do out in Southern California, in Northern California, Savannah, Houston. I mean, they're all blowing out at the seams. So it's a problem that's here to stay for a while.
And particularly in New York, New Jersey, the Port of New York and New Jersey. Mike Angel, I think we covered it on the show last week. They put in that $100 per container fee for the empties that aren't being picked up. And of course, you mentioned about dredging. When you have those massive vessels come into New York, that's their first port of call. They're not necessarily interested in filling chock full of empties, although they should be. So they're leaving more empties than they really should be. So they're trying to get empties moved. But I did read last week that someone has built a new 12-acre facility just to put empties, just to stack empties. So that, when you look at the charts, we're at about 2.64 million containers inbound in July, according to the Peers database. That's the second or third highest level. So that tells me that peak season's kind of here. But when you look at the two graphs of imports over time and exports over time, they're diverging at an increasing rate. And I know it's not funny, but the exports have really suffered. We'll have first year July export up to June export data out this week. We do some analysis on it, but it looks like exports have really suffered because of the inability of equipment to get exports out. Because a lot of folks have been, not interested in sending empty containers further inland to reload back to Asia, because they're just more interested in getting that empty box back to Asia to reload.
Yep.
So, this is a very interesting market. It's also interesting, Jeff, that a lot of carriers that I know, in particular, that were truckload carriers, power only, have switched over to the dray market because the rates there are better than over the road. So we're seeing this capacity migration happen before our eyes again.
Yeah. And in Southern California, I read an article too that they're still having problems with intermodal.
Yeah.
Being able to take that, the influx of containers out of the ports and everything, they're struggling still. Yep. I think Secor said that beginning of this week, I think it was, or maybe the end of last week. He said that it's still a problem. It's ongoing. The appointment process is still an issue, for in-gating, chassis and containers. So, it's like, where do you start to fix this problem? Everybody knows where it is, but why are they so hesitant on fixing it?
Yeah. Jeff, part of me thinks we might be at the tail end of this sort of bullwhip effect, where people over-ordered. There'll be a lot of folks that have got containers tied up in ports they're going to miss back to school season. Right, so I still think we're not out of the woods in terms of freight arriving on time seasonally. Right? So, we had a lot of stuff last year come in late, missed their season, had to find a home in a warehouse competing for the next season's inventory. I think we're still seeing the tail end of that. And I remember the guy that runs Georgia Port said last year, that was a very profound statement. He said, whenever we're over 2 million TEU imports per month, our supply chain starts to get into trouble. And if you go back and look at the data, we've been over 2 million imported containers for probably 18 to 20 months now. So we're a long way north of where the experts think an efficient supply chain is operating in the US. Because I think we've built a supply chain around, it feels like the 2 million mark is what he was saying. And when you go over that, you start to create these congestion points, whether it be at a warehouse, a chassis trailer. And part of the reason you're seeing congestion on the West Coast is because they're trying to avoid the 23 miles of trains backed up last year in Chicago.
Chicago, yeah.
So they're metering the output of outbound containers on the West Coast to match the inbound capacity inland in Kansas City, Dallas, and Joliet. So that's causing the congestion on the West Coast in particular, on top of everything else that's going on.
Yeah. What was the increase in Houston in June? Do you remember what that was? Was that
24? Yep.
24%. Now, here's the thing that's a kicker here. Long Beach, Los Angeles had the best June in history in imports of TEUs, all-time high, set all records and everything. I find that very interesting, Dean, because it went down and Houston increased. It's just like, so what happened there? I mean, it's just like, I was trying to figure this thing out. It's like, if they had such an incredible, month there, but overall the percentages weren't going anywhere, yet all the other, I mean, what would have happened if those percentages didn't go to the Houston or the Savannah or the New York, and they all came into Los Angeles and Long Beach? I mean, what the hell would have happened?
You'd have probably had a much worse situation than they've got now. So I think the reason they're only reporting 12 vessels at anchor waiting, they've got much lower volumes. Certainly, I won't say much lower volumes. On the West Coast, their volumes are down about 1% year over year. Up 5% year over year versus up 12% year over year on the East Coast, and up about 9% on the Gulf Coast. So still seeing increasing volumes, but nowhere near as much. But I think, Jeff, what we're seeing though is the post-Chinese New Year pickup, right? Because you see the volumes drop off February, March, and then they pick up April, May, June. I think what you're seeing now is that peak shipping season work its way through the ports. That's anecdotally what I'm hearing, but I haven't. The volumes for July, I've just looked at July's data here. Let me quickly pull this up. So we looked at the preliminary numbers for July based on the data from peers, and it shows that volumes nationally were up 2.4% in July compared to June, and we are up 4% year over year for the month of July. So, but some of the bigger ports, right, we saw the East Coast shift. So the shift in volume year over year to month over month was up on the East Coast, but down on the West Coast, to your point. So, month over month volumes were down slightly on the West Coast and up about 1 to 2% on the East Coast. So we're still seeing that shift. I just think that if people are in fact cancelling orders and they've already pulled forward all of this inventory and we are seeing peak shipping, then you would think that year over year comps start to go negative pretty quickly. But heck, we've still got a long way to go before we see the real impact. I think the consumer spending is still a very interesting data point. People are still buying things, even though confidence is down. We're still spending money on things that trucks haul.
Yeah, and you know what? I think this is a good segue for this. God, that graphic is great, isn't it?
Good.
It's awesome. Yeah. Well, today's lane of the day is a reefer move from Grand Rapids, Michigan to Hunts Point, New York. Line haul RPM 364 mile. All-in RPM is 432.
Yep.
The contract rate, including fuel, is 430. Year-over-year spot line haul RPM change is 28 cents below. Yep.
The produce season is just starting to kick off in Wisconsin. I was up there a couple of weeks ago. That market is they've had a pretty good start to the season up there for all their fruit and veggies. I sort of got an article in the Packer talking about this. They had a slow start. but it looks like the summer and fall produce season is going to be pretty good out of that area. So yeah, I think we're off to a good start up there. But that's not unusual from a seasonal perspective. As we get further
Right.
north, we start to get into the fall and produce season. That's why you're seeing the Pacific Northwest volumes come online. You'll see Wisconsin, upstate New York volumes. But then we're still coming out of a drought, Jeff. I was watching the news this morning and on the Weather Channel, and the guys in New Jersey, of course, that's a big blueberry state.
Yes.
They said our crops are down in terms of volume, about 30% because of the drought we've had down here. That can break pretty quickly on the northeast or the north east side of our country in terms of ability to dump water. But I think there's been a lot of volumes are down week over week and year over year in the produce market for lots of reasons. California drought is one, but we're seeing pockets where volumes are down. But a lot of water, obviously, up in Michigan, around Michigan, with the Great Lakes.
Yeah, I mean, New Jersey is big for cranberries as well.
Yes.
I mean, big, huge thing. But look at the drought in Lake Mead. Oh my God! It's just like, I mean, I've read some articles about that, and it's dropping exponentially. I mean, at a very high rate compared to year over year. Looking at 5 years, then 2 years, then year over year over year. I mean, unbelievable.
We're witnessing something very interesting that's unfolding on the west side of our country because of the extreme drought. Snowpack wasn't as good, runoff's not as good.
No.
They're rushing, trying to find more water, more drought-resistant crops. Some of the big crops like rice are planting about half their acreage this year because of the lack of water. That's not something you just get over quickly. The state is getting hotter. Nighttime temperatures are up, which is when plants normally recover. So they're not recovering quickly. The extreme heat is affecting yields. So that sort of produce, salad bowl that we call, California is going through what it looks like to be some sort of a long-term change, and that's going to affect the balance of refrigerated freight flows around the country because our demand is going to be there still, and that means that maybe import markets will pick that up, or Mexico in particular, even Canada to a degree, will probably start to see imports pick up as those volumes decrease.
Yeah, and there'll be a shift in the market as well because they can't produce the produce that they want because of the lack of water. So, like you said, they're going to have to shift all that capacity someplace else to pick up the lack, right? So it's unbelievable. I mean, look at Kentucky and what happened down there with the tremendous flooding and everything. I mean, it's just a disaster. I mean, how did that area affect the capacity and everything? What are you seeing down in that area over the last couple of weeks?
We saw a capacity impacted largely because trucks couldn't get in. So there was obviously a volume hit. But I do have some numbers here. If I could quickly pull it up, I can tell you exactly what happened in the dry van sector because there was some movement in spot rates. Capacity did tighten. So it was really pronounced in the Quincy, Illinois market, which is sort of north of St. Louis on the Mississippi River. There was flash flooding and road closures there over the last few weeks. Dry van rates jumped 18 cents a mile in Quincy to $2.35. They'd been dropping for 3 weeks prior to the floods. We saw about a 20% increase in load posts. There's some capacity did tighten in those areas that were flooded. But again, that's something we see all the time, largely because trucks can't get in. And then when they can get in, there's a rush to get freight out that's been backed up.
Yep. So where's the hot market this week and the cold market? I mean, where are you seeing where there's huge amount of capacity, not so much capacity?
Hot markets are any market where you see lots of trains trying to unload. So I would say to you that all of the intermodal ramps have been particularly hot this week. Even though the national average is like just under $2, there's still some lanes that are way above that. Our top 50 lanes by volumes moved is about $2.40 a mile. So it's about 40 cents a mile higher than the national average. So when you get into those lanes that are very dense in terms of volume, rates are higher. But
Oh,
rates, the rates in, so if I talk about the intermodal ramps, Kansas City, Joliet, Chicago, Dallas, Memphis, all those rates are up about 6 to 10 cents a mile this week because of the congestion and relatively low truckload rates compared to this time last year. Shippers are looking to move that freight over to the truckload market to get it moved, because that we're under where there's a time pressure to get that inventory moved now from a seasonal perspective. So I'd say to you, the hot markets are in particular those markets that are all attached to some of those ramps, the intermodal ramps in particular. Flatbed, California's been pretty good for flatbed carriers. It's a hot market right now. Los Angeles in particular is pretty good. So I've been watching that one. And in the refrigerated market, Bloomington, so because of the floods, southwest Indiana, southeast Illinois, Bloomington, Illinois, very, very hot market for freight rates right now for refrigerated carriers, cantaloupes, watermelons. The fields are wet. They're having a hard time getting in to actually harvest because the fields are so waterlogged. So capacity's been pretty tight, largely because carriers would have been avoiding those areas because there's too much water, and they would have known that they couldn't get loaded quickly. But of course, as soon as that eases, then there's a demand for capacity, and those carriers have got to reposition their assets into that market. In Bloomington, Illinois, rates are up 45 cents a mile higher than July for one of those big lanes to Atlanta. Regionally, rates are up about 15 cents a mile in that sort of Indiana, Illinois market last week. So yeah, definitely some relationship to the flooding and the water and the shift in capacity based on whether you can get into that market and get out with some decent loading. So that's sort of a hot market at the moment.
Yeah, I did a quote for someone late last week, and it was out of Nevada coming into New Jersey, and the intermodal rate was like 8,000 or 9,000 coming out of there. The truckload was down around 7, I think it was, on the spot market. I mean, it was like those are one of the lanes where it was just like you were saying, the capacity, congestion, all this other kind of stuff. I mean, you have to be extremely careful when you're looking at. You have to look at all options all the time, and be up to date on the market and what it's doing, and then try to help out your customers. There are times if they are moving intermodal to help them to, convert over to over the road when necessary to decrease their cost. But I'm seeing that a lot, I'm seeing that a lot in some big markets. I'm not sure when that's going to come down, but it's been up there for a while.
Yeah. The intermodal, so if you look at the intermodal volume and you follow Ari Ash on Journal of Commerce, he has a good thing called the intermodal index, I think it's called. But essentially in the contract freight market, rail has still been very competitive, rail contract rates. The spot market's another story. So if you're moving that smaller percentage of intermodal freight on the spot market, truckload on some lanes has been very attractive because the rates are so low. He puts the shipper advantage of intermodal versus truckload on spot down to about 9%. And he said what happens is that saving, if you're saving 9% on spot intermodal, it's really a wash when you add in all of the other lifting fees, all the other fees that go with intermodal, and you're better off to go with truckload. So he has this break point where he says whenever the premium of intermodal over truckload is less than 10%, it's better to put it on truck. And that's what's happening on some of those lanes because spot rates are so low.
Yes, absolutely. You have the door to door, and then you have the all-in door to door, or you have the dray to in gate, then you have the line haul, and then the dray to out gate. Gets a little bit complex in the most simplistic description. It really all depends, and on the one-offs. Go to the spot market, on the contracted, well, then that's a whole different horse of different color, right? But like I said, if you have the one-offs, it's not a bad idea to move them off the intermodal and go on over the road. But on the contracts, long term, negotiate those rates. They're really, really high right now, but they're going to come down and they're going to kind of level off at some point. But you have to be on top of that and always constantly follow that and, bring your customers up to speed. That's what we, anyway, at least we try to do. So,
yeah.
Wow. So, what a week this week has been, and this morning reading that news, Dean. Boy, I'll just tell you, it's
I'm
just
I'm just writing a couple of pieces now because there's been a lot of talk about rates, but more importantly, what it costs to operate a truck, and a fair bit of misleading information out there. It really depends on what segment you're in: full hire, private, long haul, short haul, day cab, reefer, sleeper cab. There's so many variables there. I guess the thing is there's no right or wrong answer. And but I'm writing a blog post this week on what it costs to run a truck in the spot market if you're an owner operator. And what's interesting is that as diesel comes down, I'm down to about $2.01 a mile today. I think large fleets are probably somewhere in the order of 10 to 15 cents a mile lower, but diesel is still a big driver of operating costs today. It seems like we're holding steady around that in terms of where line haul spot rates are. So that's sort of a lot of people don't believe what it really costs to run a truck these days. And
what's the percent? What's the percent now with the fuel? What are they at right now?
Fuel as a percentage of my of revenue is about 45%. So I'm at 77 cents a mile today. So if I do the math on that, my all-in costs are 201. So 77 divide. So I'm up to it's about 38% roughly.
Still way too high. I mean, when you're profitable around 25%, I mean that's still that's hard to swallow, So I feel for these carriers out there, and just got to educate. I keep on saying that, it as well. You got to educate the shipper, and try to make them understand, to your point, what it costs to run a truck, and why these rates are up so high,
If you're paying a driver 50 to 60 cents a mile, and you can't take that back. You've got benefits now, as we've talked about. The impact of AB5 is going to increase a lot of the ancillary benefits you've got to pay drivers to be competitive. So if you say it costs $2 a mile to run a truck, that's about 25 cents a mile higher than this time last year, because diesel has gone up so much. So operating costs are still high. Large truckload carriers have got it even tougher, even though they can buy things a little bit cheaper than the small guy can. Their operating costs are lower, but their driver wage costs are probably higher because it's the long haul over the road piece is such a hard job where they have a lot of driver turnover. So the operating costs are we won't see any sort of relief, I don't think, this side of Christmas in that area. As diesel comes down, obviously things will improve. But we've still got very high insurance. Diesel's going to come down more slowly than we'd like because the retailers are probably more reluctant to drop prices because of the global uncertainty. So I'm writing this piece. It'll be out sort of next week on what we think it costs to run a truck.
I'm definitely going to check it out for sure. But I'll tell you what. We should revisit this, what happened this morning next week. To see what the true impact is. I know it's a short term, but
right.
I wonder what, there's going to be a ton of articles out there, it as well as I, with this ruling this morning.
Right.
And I'm just really curious of what is going to be written by whom. That's going to put things into better perspective than what you and I are saying right now. But it's going to be a tricky situation out there. It's going to be very, very tricky.
The other thing I'm working on is I spoke to I wrote an article on this week on a $6 bet in 1938 on a golf course and a load of spoiled chickens that gave birth to the refrigerated motor invention. And of course, Thermo King was at the heart of that, but it was a $6 bet and a load of spoiled chickens between Minneapolis and Chicago that really started the refrigerated motor industry. And it got me thinking about what does it really take to run a reefer motor? So I talked to a friend of mine in Australia who's done about 6 million miles over a lot of years. He's pulled 3 trailers backwards and forwards across the outback in extreme heat. Who better to ask about how to run a fridge motor, reefer motor, than someone who's run refrigerated motors for about 125,000 engine hours. So I've got his top 10 tips on how to operate a refrigerated motor coming out in the next couple of weeks. It's fascinating reading. A lot of things in there you wouldn't see in a OEM manual, but we could talk about that also next week because
I mean, I think that's a great subject to definitely touch base on. But the other thing that I'd love to touch base on, which is touch and go situation here, is about should FSC, be a true pass through, or do you put margins on top of that? Because when you think about what the percent of fuel is and what you're adding to your line haul, and now you're upcharging it, is it really the percent?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
A lot of people are making money out of the fuel surcharge, right? If you're running 8.5 miles per gallon.
Well, yeah, and if you're running a true PC profit center, right? I mean, is it right or wrong? I put a poll out there, and is it ethical or is it unethical? That's the biggest question out there. And there's a lot of smart shippers out there who will dig into that. Okay. So I tell everybody out there, be careful what you do. And when you separate it and they ask that question, is fuel part of your cost plus program, or are you adding margins to it? I mean, there's a lot of different things there. And I think we should talk about that topic because it's a hot topic. It really is.
Fuel efficiency has changed dramatically, right? If you think about the EIA national average is like something like, I think it's 6.3, maybe 6.5 miles per gallon.
Yeah.
In the NPTC private fleet benchmarking survey, a lot of private fleets run pretty new trucks. I mean, even though the average age is about 6 years, I think they were up to about 8.3 miles per gallon as an average on those fleets. Admittedly, 25% of their miles are empty, but they weigh out before they cube out. So their private fleets are hauling weight for a lot of the big shipper manufacturers, but their MPGs are pretty good, but it's way above the EIA national average in terms of what MPG you use for your fuel surcharge calculation.
Yeah, and then when you look at the cost per mile intermodally, where you can take a full truckload and move it 450 miles in a gallon of gas.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, those are just the kind of things that you're looking at, and especially, if you're looking to reduce carbon footprint, government incentives. I think you know about that as well. As long as you make a certain percentage of that, the government will give you some money back as a shipper if you can prove that you reduced your carbon footprint. So just a lot of different things I think we should put on the topic list for when we have our meetings. I think would be a good thing to discuss.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, Dean, we're coming to the end. I appreciate your time this morning. Boy, I'll tell you, we had some good chats here, and definitely look forward to next week. Yep. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a great day and the rest of your week. Thank you. All righty.
Centurion Trucking, our motto is people before profit. Today's market requires more transparency, consistency, and focus on what our clients need to win. Centurion Trucking and American Logistics are poised to help their clients achieve and surpass their targets. If you're looking for a team that honors your needs, dreams, and aspirations, then get a hold of Daman at American Logistics or Centurion Trucking and start designing your career today.